Hello and welcome back to the Brit Lit Book Club, the podcast where we travel through the greatest stories in British literature. I'm your host, Vanessa, and today we are diving into one of the most electrifying, emotionally devastating, and genuinely revolutionary books ever written. I'm talking about Mary Shelley's Frankenstein. But more than that, I want to talk to you about the woman who wrote it, because the story of Mary Shelley is, in many ways, just as extraordinary as the novel itself. A teenage girl, grieving, brilliant, and surrounded by some of the most dazzling and destructive minds of the 19th century, sat down during a stormy summer in Switzerland and invented modern science fiction. She also wrote one of the most profound meditations on creation, responsibility, loneliness, and what it means to be human that literature has ever produced. So settle in, brew yourself something wonderful. For this episode, I'm drinking a dark masala chai. Masala chai is made with bold black tea and a blend of warm spices, cardamom, clove, cinnamon, ginger, black pepper. It's rich, complex, and a little bit dangerous. Something alchemical, which is exactly the right energy for a story about a man who locks himself in a laboratory and tries to cheat death. Okay, so who was Mary Shelley? To understand Frankenstein, you really have to understand Mary Shelley's life, because this isn't a case where the biography is a fun bonus. It's essential. The novel is soaked in her personal history in a way that's almost overwhelming once you start to see it. Mary Wollstonecraft Godwin was born on August 30th, 1797 in London, specifically in Somerstown, just north of what's now King's Cross. And from her very first breath, she was living in the shadow of extraordinary people. Her mother, Mary Wollstonecraft, if that name rings a bell, it should. Wollstonecraft was one of the most radical thinkers of the 18th century. The author of A Vindication of the Rights of Women, published in 1792. She was a proto-feminist before feminism even had a name. She argued that women weren't naturally inferior to men. They were simply denied the education and opportunity to provide otherwise. She was brave, controversial, brilliant, and deeply unconventional in her personal life, too. She had a daughter out of wedlock, attempted suicide twice, and refused to be boxed in by the expectations of her time. Tragically, Mary Wollstonecraft died just 11 days after giving birth to her daughter, from complications of childbirth, as was so common back then. Mary Shelley grew up never knowing her mother, but living entirely in the mythology of her. There were portraits of Wollstonecraft throughout the house. Her books were on every shelf. Her father spoke of her constantly, and young Mary would apparently go to her mother's grave in St. Pancras' Old Church in London to read, sitting beside the headstone, surrounded by the quiet of the churchyard, feeling close to a woman she never got to meet. That image absolutely stops me every time, and that churchyard is still there. If you ever find yourself in London, it's an extraordinary and quietly moving place to visit. There's even a monument to Wollstonecraft in the gardens nearby. It's the kind of place that makes literature feel very real. Her father was William Godwin, also a radical philosopher, an anarchist in the true intellectual sense, and the author of Political Justice. So Mary grew up in a household that was basically a salon for the most progressive, provocative thinkers in England. Writers, philosophers, and freethinkers were constantly passing through. It was an extraordinary education, informal, electric, and completely unlike anything available to most women of her day. Now, we have to talk about Percy Shelley, because you simply cannot tell Mary's story without him. Though I will say up front, their relationship was complicated in ways that deserve real honesty. Percy Shelley was a poet. A genuinely gifted, blazingly idealistic, charismatic, and also deeply irresponsible poet. He was already married to a woman named Harriet when he became a fixture in William Godwin's household and fell passionately in love with 16-year-old Mary. By 1814, the two of them had eloped to France, taking Mary's stepsister Claire along with them. Living on almost no money, traveling through a Europe still recovering from the Napoleonic Wars. They were rejected by their families. They faced real poverty, and within months of their elopement, Mary became pregnant. Their first baby, a daughter, was born prematurely in February 1815 and died 12 days later. Mary recorded in her diary, "Find my baby dead, a most miserable day." She was just 17 years old. This loss haunted her. She dreamed about the baby. She wrote about bringing her back to life. You can draw an almost unbearably direct line from the grief to the central obsession of Frankenstein. The desperate, dangerous desire to undo death, to reanimate what has been lost. In 1816, she had a son, William, named after her father. But loss would keep following her. Between 1815 and 1819, Mary Shelley lost 3 of her 4 children. Her dear friend Fanny Imlay, her half-sister, took her own life in 1816. Harriet, Percy's abandoned wife, drowned herself later that same year, and Percy himself would die in 1822, when his boat capsized in a storm off the coast of Italy. He was 29 years old. Mary was 24 and widowed with 1 surviving child. She outlived almost everyone she loved, and she never remarried. But let's talk about the summer that changed everything. Let's go back to the summer of 1816, because this is where Frankenstein was born, and it is one of the most extraordinary stories in all of literary history. The spring and summer of 1816 is known as the year without a summer. In April 1815, Mount Tambora in Indonesia had erupted, the largest volcanic eruption recorded in history. The ash cloud spread across the globe, blocking out sunlight, dropping temperatures, destroying crops. 1816 was cold, dark, and relentlessly gloomy across Europe. In many parts of the world, it caused famine and social unrest. In Switzerland, it created the Gothic atmosphere for one of the greatest literary experiments ever attempted. Mary and Percy traveled to Geneva that summer, along with Claire Clairmont, who was, at this point, having an affair with Lord Byron. Byron himself was in exile from England after a particularly spectacular personal scandal involving rumors of incest with his half-sister and the complete collapse of his marriage. He rented the Villa Diodati on the shores of Lake Geneva, a grand and atmospheric property overlooking the water. Mary, Percy, and Claire stayed nearby at a smaller cottage called Maison Chapuis, and the group spent long evenings together at the villa, talking, reading, and watching the storms roll across the lake. Now, Byron had a personal physician and companion with him named John Polidori. And this group of 5 brilliant, restless, romantic minds, essentially trapped indoors by volcanic winter, did what any of us would do. They entertained each other with ghost stories. Byron proposed a competition. Each of them would write a horror story. Byron himself wrote a fragment. Polidori eventually turned his contribution into The Vampire, the direct literary ancestor of Dracula. And 18-year-old Mary Shelley, after several days of feeling she had nothing to contribute, woke from a waking dream, a vivid, terrifying vision of a pale student of the unhallowed arts kneeling beside the thing he had put together, watching it stir to life. That was the spark of Frankenstein. The Villa Diodati still exists. It's a private home today, but you can walk past it and stand by the lakeside and look across the water. And if you happen to be there on a stormy evening, I promise you will feel something. The atmosphere around Lake Geneva, particularly looking up towards the mountains, has this wild, sublime quality that Mary describes so beautifully in the novel. It's one of those places that simply feels Gothic. Frankenstein, or The Modern Prometheus, was published on January 1st, 1818. Mary was just 20 years old, and here's the detail that never fails to astonish me. It was published anonymously. The first edition carried a preface written by Percy Shelley, and most readers simply assumed he had written it. The idea that a teenage girl had produced this philosophically dense, structurally sophisticated, emotionally devastating novel was apparently inconceivable to the literary world of 1818. Is anyone surprised? When the second edition was published in 1823, Mary's name finally appeared on the cover. She was 25, and the secret was out. The novel is structured as a series of nested narratives. A letter writer reports the accounts of Captain Walton, who relays the story of Victor Frankenstein, who in turn quotes the creature's own account of his life. It's a brilliantly designed structure that keeps asking the reader, whose story is this really? Who are we supposed to believe? Who deserves our sympathy? And that question is at the heart of why Frankenstein is so much more than a horror story. The creature, and I want to be clear that Mary never calls him a monster, never gives him a name, never presents him as simply evil, teaches himself to read by secretly observing a family in the woods. He discovers literature, history, and philosophy. He reads Milton's Paradise Lost and sees himself as Adam. But an Adam abandoned by his creator, cast out before he could be loved. He longs for connection, for belonging, for someone to look at him without revulsion. And when he is rejected repeatedly, violently, by every human he encounters, including Victor himself, he turns to destruction. Not because he is inherently monstrous, but because he has been made monstrous by the cruelty of others. That is the feminist reading, the humanist reading, the reading that makes this novel timeless. The creature is not the villain. Abandonment is. Frankenstein sits at the very heart of the Gothic literary tradition, that rich, dark vein of British literature that runs from Horace Walpole's Castle of Otranto in 1764 through Anne Radcliffe, Matthew Lewis, and of course straight into the Victorian era with Bram Stoker, Wilkie Collins, and Robert Louis Stevenson. The Gothic isn't just about scares. It's about the things that polite society doesn't want to look at. Hidden secrets, repressed desires, the supernatural as a metaphor for the psychological. Mary Shelley took that tradition and did something no one had done before. She grounded it in science. Victor Frankenstein isn't a sorcerer. He's a student of natural philosophy at the University of Ingolstadt in Germany, a real institution with real scientific prestige. His obsession with reanimating life was directly inspired by the very real and very fashionable science of Galvanism, Luigi Galvani's experiments in the 1780s and 90s demonstrating that electrical currents could cause the muscles of dead frogs to twitch. By the time Mary was writing, scientists were performing public galvanic experiments on human corpses in London, and audiences were both horrified and enthralled. She took that genuine scientific anxiety. In doing so, she invented science fiction, not as a genre label, that came much later, but as a mode of storytelling that uses scientific possibility to explore ethical and philosophical questions. Every science fiction story you have ever loved, from H.G. Wells to Aldous Huxley to Margaret Atwood to Jurassic Park, owes a debt to this 20-year-old woman and her stormy Swiss summer. Let's talk about Frankenstein in modern culture. The cultural footprint of Frankenstein is almost impossible to overstate. We should probably start with the most iconic image of all, and immediately complicate it. In 1931, Universal Pictures released the film Frankenstein, starring Boris Karloff, with makeup designer Jack Pierce creating a new iconic flat-topped, bolt-necked creature that has become the dominant image in popular culture. It was a masterpiece of horror cinema, and Karloff's performance was genuinely moving. But it also did something very significant to the story. It stripped away the creature's eloquence, his philosophy, his devastating interiority. The film's creature barely speaks. He is a monster, full stop. The book's creature quotes Paradise Lost. There is a profound difference. This is one of the most interesting gaps between literary original and cultural adaptation. And it's worth asking why it happened. Is it easier or more comforting to have a creature who is simply terrifying? If the creature can speak, can reason, can articulate his suffering, then we have to grapple with our own culpability. If he's just a monster, we don't. Beyond that 1931 film, Frankenstein has spawned hundreds of adaptations, films, plays, musicals, graphic novels, and television series. The most thoughtful recent adaptation is arguably the National Theatre's 2011 stage production, directed by Danny Boyle, in which Benedict Cumberbatch and Johnny Lee Miller alternated the roles of Victor and the creature at different performances, a brilliant theatrical choice that underscores the book's argument that creator and creation are reflections of each other. And the legacy continues today. We can see the DNA of Frankenstein in virtually every story about artificial intelligence, genetic engineering, and the ethics of creation. When we debate the rights of AI systems, or the ethics of cloning, or designer babies, or bringing back extinct species, we are essentially having the argument that Mary Shelley started in 1818. Victor Frankenstein's crime wasn't that he created life. It was that he refused to take responsibility for what he'd made. That question, what do we owe to the things we bring into the world, has never felt more urgent. Now, a little something for those of you who like to walk in the footsteps of your favorite authors. And if you're a regular listener, I know that's most of you. Mary Shelley doesn't quite have the same concentration of preserved literary sites as Jane Austen or the Brontes, partly because she spent so much time of her life abroad, and partly because she moved around frequently after Percy's death. But there are some genuinely wonderful places to seek out. In London, as I mentioned, St. Pancras Old Church and its gardens are deeply connected to Mary. Her mother is buried there, and it's where she and Percy first declared their love. It's a truly atmospheric spot, tucked behind the bustle of King's Cross. The nearby British Library also holds original manuscripts from the Shelley Circle, if you're interested in archival treasures. In Bath, Percy and Mary spent time in Bath in 1816, and it's a city already deeply associated with Gothic fiction through the work of our beloved Jane Austen, specifically Northanger Abbey, which is itself a Gothic parody. The Swiss lakes and the Alps, which feature so dramatically in Frankenstein, particularly the sublime mountain scenes, are of course a journey further than our current British tours, but for anyone planning independent travel, the area around Lake Geneva and Chamonix is unlike anywhere else on Earth. The sublime landscape Mary describes, those vast, inhuman peaks that make Victor feel both awed and terrified, is completely real and completely breathtaking. And if you want to stay in England and connect with Gothic literary tradition more broadly, Yorkshire is absolutely the place. The moors, the wild landscape, the sense of isolation and brooding atmosphere. It's the same tradition that Mary Shelley was working within, the same landscape that would inspire Emily Bronte just a couple of decades later. I want to come back to something before we close, because I think it deserves its own moment. Mary Shelley wrote Frankenstein as a teenager, in the shadow of a radical feminist mother she never met, alongside men who were celebrated as geniuses, while she was overlooked. The novel is, among many other things, a story about what happens when men play God without women, when creation is entirely male, sterile of the warmth and relationship that sustains life. Victor never involves his fiancée Elizabeth in his work. He creates life without love. He abandons his creation without care. He is, in the most profound sense, a bad parent. And the novel argues that this failure of nurture is catastrophic. There's also a compelling reading of the creature as a figure of the female experience, a being denied agency, authorship, a name, recognition, and love, forced to observe the world from the outside, judged on appearance rather than substance, and eventually destroyed, not for what he does, but for what he represents. When you read those passages in the novel, where the creature watches the de Lacy family through a crack in the wall, longing to be included, learning language, and love from a distance he could never close, it's genuinely heartbreaking. Mary Shelley knew what it was to be brilliant and invisible. The first edition didn't even have her name on it. Mary Shelley lived until 1851. She was 53 when she died in London of what is believed to have been a brain tumor. She outlived Percy by nearly 30 years. She spent those decades writing, editing, and working to preserve Percy's literary legacy, but also producing her own substantial body of work: novels, short stories, travel writing, and biography. Her heart, and this is a detail almost too Gothic to be believed, was found wrapped in a silk parcel in her desk after her death. Percy's heart, which had been recovered from his funeral pyre on the Italian beach and given to Mary, had been kept there for nearly 3 decades. She had carried it with her, literally, for 30 years. I don't think any of us can read Frankenstein the same way after knowing that. So this week, I invite you to pick up Mary Shelley's Frankenstein, or perhaps return to it if you've read it before, and read it not as a horror story, but as a love letter and a lament, a meditation on creation and abandonment, on the monsters we make and the monsters we become. And if you're interested in exploring Gothic literary landscapes in person, visit our website, thebookclubtour.com, to learn more about our tours. Before I let you go, I want to leave you with a little reading list, because if Frankenstein has lit something up in you today, there is so much more to explore. First and most obviously, if you haven't read Frankenstein itself, please do. And if you have, I'd encourage you to seek out the 1818 first edition, rather than the more commonly reprinted 1831 revision. Mary made significant changes to the later edition, toning down some of the more radical elements and adding a more fatalistic, almost religious framework. The 1818 text is more raw, younger, and in many ways more interesting. Several modern editions published both texts side by side, which is a wonderful way to see the writer in conversation with her younger self. For biography, I have 2 recommendations. The first is Miranda Seymour's Mary Shelley, published in 2000. It is a gold standard life of Shelley, thoroughly researched and beautifully written, the kind of biography that reads like a novel and leaves you feeling you've lost a friend when it's over. The second is Charlotte Gordon's Romantic Outlaws, The Extraordinary Lives of Mary Wollstonecraft and Mary Shelley. And this one in particular is special. It tells the story of both mother and daughter in alternating chapters, weaving their 2 lives together across time, even though they never knew each other. Given everything we talked about today, Mary reading at her mother's grave, growing up in the shadow of a woman she never knew, this book will absolutely wreck you in the best way possible. If you want to understand the literary tradition that Frankenstein was born from and helped to shape, I'd suggest 2 companions. Anne Radcliffe's The Mysteries of Udolpho, published in 1794, just 3 years before Mary Shelley was born, is the Gothic novel that defined the genre before Mary came along and revolutionized it. It's atmospheric, suspenseful, and surprisingly modern in its psychological depth. And then Robert Louis Stevenson's The Strange Case of Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde, published in 1886, is the perfect companion piece to Frankenstein, another story about a scientist who meddles with the boundaries of human nature and destroys himself in the process. Reading them together is a masterclass in how the Gothic tradition evolved across the 19th century. And finally, if our episode has made you curious about Mary's mother, please do read Mary Wollstonecraft's A Vindication of the Rights of Women. It was published in 1792. It is fiercely intelligent and surprisingly readable, and knowing that this was the woman whose grave young Mary sat beside to do her reading makes every page feel electric. To understand where Frankenstein came from, you have to understand Mary Shelley, and to understand Mary Shelley, you have to begin with her mother. Thanks for joining me on this episode about Mary Shelley and Frankenstein. I hope you've learned a little bit, and I hope you'll continue reading. Until then, keep reading and stay curious.